Tibet has always been a mysterious and inaccessible country, lying north of India, beyond the Himalayas, and until recently a place that few outsiders visited. In 1949, a communist regime was established in China. A year later, the Chinese army invaded Tibet. The Tibetans tried to negotiate a peaceful solution, but by 1959, it was clear the Chinese intended to destroy this ancient culture. The Dalai Lama, fearing for his life, escaped over the Himalayas to India. He was followed later by thousands of fellow refugees. India welcomed the Dalai Lama and gave him land in the Himalayas. He settled in Dharamsala and established a government in exile until a return to Tibet was possible. Now, almost 50 years later, the Dalai Lama and 130,000 exiles are still unable to return to their homeland. The Chinese continue to occupy Tibet, where 6 million Tibetans live under a repressive regime that denies them religious, political, and cultural freedom. Tibetans are estimated to be outnumbered 3 to 1, and unless there is a radical change in policy by the Chinese, this situation can only get worse.
I hope I'm wrong, but as I see it, regarding the future for Tibetans as a nation, their time is running out. The Chinese are playing for time, we're playing into their hands. Every day, while we are praying for world peace here, there's more and more and more and more Chinese moving in. Soon there will be so many Chinese in Tibet. There will be no hope whatsoever for Tibetans to ever regain control over their homeland.
This sand mandala is painstakingly created by Tibetan monks as a ritual painting that embodies the spirit of Buddhism. It illustrates one of the basic ideas of this religion. All things are impermanent and nothing can last forever. Tibetan culture, like this mandala, has a unique spirituality. It's now facing a real crisis where it could easily lose its identity and disappear forever. As the prayer wheel spins, it is believed that thousands of prayers inside are sent out into the universe. This faith in a greater good has kept the Tibetan people's hope alive. In recent years, the influences of the outside world have increased dramatically, making it harder for Tibetan exiles to hold on to their cultural identity. There are divisions within the community about how to achieve a return to Tibet, and world governments have failed to help the Tibetans in any meaningful way. As time runs out, the only remaining hope for the survival of their culture and a return to Tibet has been left in the hands of the Dalai Lama and the exile community. Dharamsala and MacLeod Ganj, once little-known mountain towns, are now the hub of the Tibetan exile community and an important stop on the tourist trail. Alongside the Indian community, some Tibetans have thriving businesses. And all children go to Tibetan schools in a continuing effort to keep their cultural identity alive. Other institutions have been set up to preserve as many aspects of Tibetan life as possible. Buddhism and the monastic tradition have always been a fundamentally important part of Tibetan culture. Compassion, tolerance and kindness are integral to the Tibetan way of life. Before the Chinese invasion, about a quarter of the population in Tibet lived in monasteries, with the Dalai Lama as the spiritual and political leader. The Chinese destroyed 6,000 monasteries and thousands of monks were killed or imprisoned. Many others escaped into exile, where they built monasteries to preserve the Tibetan Buddhist traditions. Tenzin Chogyal, who's the Dalai Lama's youngest brother and former private secretary, was once a monk and has first-hand knowledge of the monastic system and its history.
When we first came, I think we concentrated to re-establish the important institutions. And monasteries which were important were monasteries that really made a difference in education standards of the monks. And the aim is to facilitate spiritual growth of the persons who have joined monasteries or nunneries. And the monasteries have a program. And the program is to study, meditate, and to engage in the spiritual path.
Anyone who wants to join a monastery has to have a sincere commitment and understand what is needed for a spiritual life.
When you become a monk, there are three things you need to change, which are known as changing the name, changing the costumes, and changing the attitude, to symbolize that you are not a lay person, that now you are an ordained person. These three changes take place. Now the purpose of becoming a monk and changing the attitude means that now you should concentrate more towards spiritual practices, which is directed towards benefiting the larger community, the larger society. Also, you should be someone who cares more, not just for the benefit of this life, but for many lives to come, a larger picture, larger perspective. And you direct yourself towards achieving complete liberation. In Buddhism, it is called nirvana.
In Tibet, many joined monasteries when they were very young. This custom is still followed in exile.
The same traditional process of encouraging people to become monks still it is very much there among the elder generations. So they encourage their children to become monks and nuns, even when they are young age, when they do not understand anything.
I have very deep interest to become a monk when I was young, like 7, 8 years old. And I don't know anything about it, but I just like to become a monk. And then, so when I was 13 years old, then I actually, my parents let me go in the monastery. Before that, my parents didn't, because I was too young. And so then I'm just like it to become a monk. When I see the monks, when I saw monks and I just imitate them.
Some monks who've joined early remain in monasteries without having a true vocation. This creates problems when they grow up and can lead to them leaving, which has a disruptive effect on monastic life. One of the reasons monks join monasteries when they're very young is because monastic education usually lasts for many years. Questions remain about a young person's understanding of what it means to make such a commitment and whether the age for joining a monastery should be changed.
I would prefer a monastery which is composed of people who have become monks at a later life and who have really developed renunciation rather than, scholaristic qualities. Now, I'm not advocating let's have, dumb monks and nuns. I'm not advocating that. But in search of scholaristic excellence, I think we are sacrificing something. Now, among the scholars who really excel, you find people who are egomaniacs. And they still wear the monk's robe, but it's defeating the purpose again. So I think monasteries and nunneries, I think, should be for people who have really developed or who have really cultivated renunciation. And renunciation probably is not a very good word. I would rather, side by side, use the word a deep realization that all worldly pursuit, it's not the real beneficial aim to achieve, but there is something beyond.
Increasing access to the outside world is now exposing monks to new and often distracting influences that make renunciation a greater challenge.
When you use the word renunciate after becoming a monk, normally people misunderstand it by saying that, okay, I'll just move somewhere and get rid of all my belongings and articles. Strictly speaking, not in that sense, but in the sense that you mentally remove, abandon, clinging, possessiveness, and egoistic attitude towards yourself, towards your relatives and friends, and towards the belongings. It is the mental, getting rid of the mental craving, rather than just throwing away the material things. Because material things themselves, if you don't have obsessive attachment, they can be facilitating factors. It is in that sense that you free yourself, in that sense that you really become a renounced person.
Traditionally, monastic life involved living in seclusion and having little contact with the lay community. Some younger monks now find this idea unrealistic.
People thinking monks must live in the caves and holding malas and this kind of thing. So actually, monks doesn't mean purified or enlightened. People expecting very high expectation, and when the people see monks swimming, let's say riding a motorbike, so on, people get a shock, how come?
Even though life in exile is very different from how it was in Tibet, monks are still expected to act appropriately. If high standards of behaviour are not maintained, the reputation and integrity of the monasteries may become compromised.
If the monasteries and nunneries are composed of people who can merely wear the robe and who can chant a little bit, and not really leading a spiritual life or the spirit of Buddhism, I think it's deceiving people. So I think two things here. First, people who are not up to it, they are allowed to enter. So, second, breakdown of discipline. We all must know what we are doing, and that too we must know whether we want to do it or not. If you don't want to do it, leave it. You can always do something else. So if by becoming a monk you want to earn a living, then I think that's the wrong reason.
Your purpose of being in the monastery is to wholeheartedly study, spend your life in the spiritual way and try to benefit other people. Now if you don't engage in those kind of responsibilities, but rather have a nice time in the monastery, neither studying nor doing anything for the good of other people, but simply depending on other people's hard work, then that is a kind of exploitation, it's a wrong livelihood. So this should be discouraged.
During the early years in exile, monks and nuns lived relatively reclusive lives with little to distract them. As the Tibetan issue has become more publicized, the outside world is intruding more and more. The number of tourists coming to Dharamsala is rising. Contact with foreigners is increasing. And access to modern technology is becoming easier.
So actually it's become harder and harder to live as a simple monk, because environment. So it's very challenging. Sometimes, I'm just paying all my money on, putting all my money on the, electronic things and wasting a lot of my time on the electronic things. So this is my kind of, for my personal challenging.
We are now in a totally different environment where there's so much material attraction. And it is because of this, then at the later age, when they grow up, they are unable to continue with their monkhood. They get disrobed. So there is very much there.
One day, sooner or later, the wine will definitely go sour. And then I think it's a national tragedy. And I think in this score, the blatant thing that we see, it's behavior of Tibetans who are dressed as monks. And small scandals are happening. And people know about it, people write about it. And I think it's just tip of the iceberg. So unless we behave, I think we will definitely bring our own downfall. Like all transitional period, maybe this is a transition, maybe not, but there is something not quite right. But then at the same time, in this, squalorish air or atmosphere, we do have people who are very competent and who are practitioners, who are shining examples. We mustn't forget those too. And they also thrived in this society.
The influences of the outside world on monastic life continue to increase. The monasteries have the difficult task of finding ways to cope with this situation while keeping the traditions intact.
So it all depends on the authorities. Each college has abbot, disciplinarian, there's a committee. I think they should be more vigilant, not only in the monastery, but in all our institutions. I think there has to be some kind of a enthusiasm that's born out of a conviction. Wherever we are, I think we have to care. We have to care. We cannot afford to be indifferent.
In the last 15 years, far more attention has been given to the Tibetan nuns. Many nuns continue to escape into exile because of religious repression in Tibet. The Tibetan Nuns Project provides food, shelter, education and medical care, enabling them to continue to uphold their traditions. Rinchen Kando Chögyal, former education minister in the exile government, co-founded the Tibetan Nuns Project and has dedicated herself to improving the life of all nuns living in exile.
I felt the need to create a system of education for the nuns. And it was at this time I founded this Tibetan Nuns Project, because there were nuns from as far back as we had the monks. But we don't see a single geshe or highly educated nun today, whereas we have so many geshes and so many highly educated monks all over. And now mind you, this is not to compete. This is not to say that we want what they have, but we definitely would like to have what's good for us. And I say that education is important, especially in a field like they have chosen, because then they can see the value of a spiritual path. When they first came from Tibet, 99% didn't know how to read or write, even Tibetan, leave alone any other languages. So today they're talking about graduation, they're talking about debates, they're talking about philosophy. I think it's wonderful.
Debating is one of the ways in which monks and nuns test their understanding of Buddhist philosophy in a practical way. Kelsang Wangdo, originally from Germany, adopted Buddhism 17 years ago and became a nun. Since then, she's lived amongst Tibetan nuns in Dharamsala.
The idea is not just to study the philosophy in class and to memorize and study that, but to also go out and discuss and debate it. It's a certain style of debate. It's quite different to the West, the Western way of debating. So usually like one person sits down and another person is standing in front of that person and clapping their hands. So the person sitting down is answering, and the person clapping their hand, every time they ask a question, they clap their hand. And so the idea of debating that way is to take the text that we study in class, so every day we take maybe one paragraph or sometimes a whole chapter, and take this particular text and debate on it.
This depth of study is only possible for those living in exile and is an important part of the vision of the Tibetan Nuns Project.
The purpose of educating the Tibetan women is so that they will retain the culture in the best way possible, and not only retain it within themselves, but later on become teachers, house parents in the schools, and then contribute to the children what they have learned. Since they have chosen not to raise a family of their own, I think that they should be ready to devote their life in the service of humanity.
Until recently, the nunneries received considerably less funding than the monasteries. Now, most nuns get sponsorship from abroad through the Tibetan Nuns Project.
The majority of our nuns are very poor. They really don't have much of anything, but they are 100% being supported by us. But, things like cell phones, tape recorders, and fancy shoes, these are not beyond their reach. They could if they wanted to. But I don't think these are anything that they should even think about. I always tell them, please don't go for external glamour. Because external glamour is not going to get you anywhere. The world is happy with us. The world community is kind to us today, not because of external glamour, because we have a good heart. Because we are peaceful people. That's why people are coming and caring for us.
Although the standard of living for nuns has risen in recent years, they still have to contend with the influences from the outside world. In the Dharamsala area, many of the monasteries and nunneries are located close to the lay community.
In this area here, it's difficult because in Tibet the circumstances were just right. I mean, it was just easy to have a monastery built a little bit far away, but when, like around Meklaganj, for example, it's a very small area with lots of people living together, and it's just not possible to have a monastery completely different from the local community. So then it does get difficult, and that's why they say these are the degenerate times. I mean, one of the reasons is that monks, have more contact with, monks and nuns have more contact with lay people, and a lot of monks and nuns disrobe because of, being tempted and wanting to do the same thing and not seeing the sense of being a monk or nun anymore. It's said that Buddhism cannot survive without the monks and nuns community because they are the ones studying, meditating and giving on the tradition.
I think a seed is sown by which, after another generation, I think the nuns will do extremely well. And, their having been neglected, it's quite obvious. And I think this problem, it's being redressed. And then also, I think the nuns should come up. They should have more confidence. They should become more vocal. They should exert their presence.
Continued religious suppression by the Chinese in Tibet leaves the responsibility for the survival of Tibetan Buddhism with the monasteries and nunneries in exile. As a return to Tibet in the near future is highly unlikely, it has become critical to find solutions to the current problems so that Tibetan Buddhism can continue to survive. Another aspect of exile life that is essential to the long-term survival of the culture is secular education. When the Tibetans first arrived in India, the Tibetan Children's Village was founded. It now has branches throughout India and looks after the education of about 15,000 children.
In the early 1960s, one of the biggest problems at that time was the influx of the refugees following His Holiness when he escaped out of Tibet. One of the first things that His Holiness did on his arrival here in Dharamsala was to send out his officials to the Tibetan refugee camps to see the actual condition of the children.
This Tibetan Children's Village came into being as an orphanage in the very early 60s. Because that was the time when people had just escaped from Tibet and many parents had died because of not being able to cope with the climate and change of habits, and above all, I think, the suffering within, thinking that they lost the country. So as a result, we had so many children who didn't have any parents.
I was educated in TCV, so I grew up in Tibetan Children's Village because my mother and father, they were given a job to look after the Tibetan children in one of the homes in TCV, When we first came to India, around those times, I was told that there were around 50 children, mostly orphans and semi-orphans. So during those times, I think the main purpose of educating Tibetan children was more that of nursing. And then around 1970s, there was, because of the foreign donations and some improvement in the facilities, and then also because of the recognition from the Indian government, the schools we had, and then I think there was an improvement, education was more in the center.
In the early 1970s, the Tibetan Children's Village was being run by the Dalai Lama's sister, Jetsum Pema. The school was admitting more children and desperately needed committed people to help improve the facilities.
When I arrived in the children's village, there was around 900 kids, and some of them in their late teens. There wasn't a sports ground. I joined on 2nd November 1974 and started building the current, working on the current school sports ground. Then there was the other more worrying factor that they had only up to class 8. So then I got involved into trying to upgrade the school, recruit teachers, and that's how I then ended up even being appointed principal when I was only 24 in 1976. And I had the pleasure also to get involved. It was a great experience working under Jetsum Pema, where if you had an idea and you were prepared to make it work, she was there to provide the wherewithal.
Today, it's one of the most important centers of learning for Tibetan children. The Tibetan government in exile has about 87 such schools in exile. That's in Nepal, Bhutan, and India. And I think these are very, very important because this is where the children are learning about their own identity, their culture, their language, and also at the same time being taught to how to face the modern world today.
In the primary school level, we have totally adopted a curriculum so suitable to our children. This is because these children are now living in exile. Many of them are born and they have never seen what Tibet is. So we feel that our children need to be taught about what Tibet is, the culture of Tibet, or our Tibetan language, our history, our traditions, our songs and dances. So to do this, we have a very strong education program in the junior school level, and we call this as a Tibetanization program. So whereby all the subjects or the medium of instruction in the classes are all through the mother tongue Tibetan language, and English is taught as a very strong second language.
Since the 1970s, world awareness of the Tibetans in exile has steadily grown, and help in the form of sponsorship has been given to enable many aspects of exile life to continue.
The Tibetan community is not yet rich enough to educate all our children by ourselves. And since we live in exile, we still have so many needs as a refugee community that all the parents are not able to pay for their children's education. So here, what the organizations like TCV and the education department of the Tibetan government in exile, what they do is they get sponsors for each child. And each sponsor pays certain amount of money for each child every month. And from there, the school manages to clothe, feed, and pay for the education and medical care of the children.
I feel very strongly about what they have done to me. This is something very, something very special. They are French and I'm a Tibetan. Our teachers, they used to tell us the sponsors, they are not rich people. They are ordinary people who make sacrifices.
Well, we've been in exile for the last now more than 4 decades. And the exile life has gone through a lot of changes. And initially, I must say that the older generation, my parents' generation who came here, they had an extremely difficult time, not knowing how to speak other languages, not knowing how to even ask for aid. But over the years, people began more acquainted with the ways of life in exile, and so they also started doing little businesses here and there. Then more of the international community came to know about the Tibetans, so we became much more looked after than those days. But then, as it went on, the concept of over-dependency was very, very much in our minds, because we felt, or I feel, that it's one of the worst things that one human being can go through, being over-dependent on somebody, because that sort of kills your inner self. We told the parents, the moment you can pay something for the children's education, please come forward and do that. We want you to take some responsibility. It is not the amount of money, but it's the feeling behind the money. So accordingly, we made a scheme that one could pay 50%, 25%, or even 10% of the whole cost.
The traditional aspects of education have been addressed by the Tibetan Children's Village, but some of those who went through the education system think it hasn't done enough to help young Tibetans and feel it needs to be reviewed and updated.
Education in TCV is very traditional, but by traditional, it's very much teacher-oriented. So most of the things are done by teachers. It's what we call spoon feeding. The culture is such that it doesn't encourage students to read textbooks. And since everything is done by the teachers, it leaves very little space for the students, for the imagination to grow, and it also kills the reading culture. I think we should encourage students to read textbooks and try to introduce new subjects. They have failed to inspire students to go on their own individual initiative.
There is a difference of opinion about how successful the TCV has been in preparing children for life in the modern world.
Education system, on the whole, as I think, failed. Most of us out of this education system, we are mediocres. We have not many who can compete in the world market, and that is not to blame to anyone else, but of course because we had so much trouble, in the early stages of life, soon after the Chinese invasion, and so this is one of the major factors. And on the other hand, of course, then we see now time has passed, and the world is changing, and we should be able to adapt. We have certain kind of also responsibility, and those things that went wrong in our lifetime, we don't want to repeat them in the children of the future. We went through those problems, and we are the ones who can tell best what really went wrong, and analyze and somehow try to find out what is good for these present Tibetans who are coming out, because otherwise we'll all be mediocres, and we will not be productive.
We've been reasonably successful because of all the wonderful teachers, and mainly because of His Holiness's guidance, and also because of the older parents' way of life that they showed to us, being content with very little. But as the generation is changing, I don't think we can sit back and say it'll remain like this forever. We have to really work harder, and we have to find ways of working with the younger generation.
The Dalai Lama has always said that education is very important from the earliest stages of life, and that it is not enough just to give information to children.
We must cultivate in the minds of children that the deeper value of human being, and that means the compassion, tolerance, sense of involvement, respect others' right. These are the basic human values. these basic human good quality must make clear in the minds of children. These are the real sources of good future, foundation of good future or happy future. Education alone, no guarantee. Education is something like instrument. Whether that instrument used for constructive or destructive, not very sure. This very much depend on the user. That means the human oneself, or its own motivation. Much depend on the motivation.
This spiritual approach underlies many aspects of Tibetan life and has helped unify the community. Since Tibetans first came into exile, there have been divisions about how to achieve a return to Tibet. Some believe in a non-violent approach and would accept autonomy under China. Others feel that fighting for a free Tibet is the only option. These different viewpoints are giving Tibetan children a confusing message about their future.
There is a general sense of confusion in the effort, but also there is a sense of loss of direction in the purpose to disadvantage our children by overburdening them with past and not adequately preparing them for a future that they will have to face outside of our sheltered exile existence. That is not fair. Requiring them an added burden of coping with Tibetan language, Tibetan culture, and also religious studies is justified only and if only returning to a free Tibet is the goal. So to that extent, we are neither here nor there. We are not educating them to equip them to survive in India or elsewhere in the world. At the same time, we are not motivated enough to prepare them to cope with this extra burden and to give them a sense of meaning and purpose in life.
A few young people have found a direction by training in traditional crafts. The Norbalinka Centre near Dharamsala has workshops where tankas are produced. These are religious paintings, and it takes many years to learn this skill. The woodworking and metalwork workshops provide employment on a small scale. The increased number of tourists has boosted the economy. At the same time, exposure to the Western outlook on life is eroding traditional life. At the Tibetan Institute for the Performing Arts, an effort has been made to teach young people traditional music and dance which have died out in Tibet. Some young people find work in small co-ops, while others find tourist-related work in restaurants in Dharamsala. Interaction with foreigners and exposure to mass media and the internet have introduced young Tibetans to the Western way of life. Without a clearly defined purpose or job prospects, many feel their only choice is to look for work abroad. The government in exile sanctions this emigration, but this only encourages further dispersal of Tibetan youth.
We have right now this growing number of young Tibetans who are unemployed. So if they are able to legally migrate to the West, the pressure of increasing number of unemployed Tibetan young people would be reduced. India for us is our second home. We feel, India is not that different from Tibet. But for young Tibetans migrating to the West, they feel, they in a totally different world. So in this way, their sense of being Tibetan becomes so much more pronounced.
Some think going to the West makes young Tibetans more aware of their cultural identity. Others believe Tibetans living abroad will be absorbed by foreign cultures and that intermarriage contributes to this situation.
Another problem that has been growing over the last maybe 10-15 years is young people. To some extent this is understandable, but I think there are some where they are actively trying to marry outside the community as a means of then securing for themselves a future as individuals. Now they are no longer in a position to dedicate themselves to maintaining their identity as Tibetans.
The pursuit of happiness, I hold it very holy and dear. So if people want to go abroad, I think they should go because they want to go. And if they want to intermarry, go ahead. But know what you're doing. I'm not against it.
Some Tibetans who've married foreigners and who live in other countries seem to be holding on to their identity while living outside the Tibetan community.
The present wife, she's totally Swiss. I don't have to worry. I have no confusion. She is what she is. I've been living in Switzerland for many years, for the last 15 years. All my friends in India are gone somewhere. I know they have left to America. And so I didn't know what to do, but I thought I'd give myself a last chance to be in Switzerland. So then I lived with her, and then so we have 2 children, and so we have succeeded being together for the last 6 years, you see. To be a Tibetan today means to have an identity. So what I've decided is to play music and sing, so that the true culture of Tibet will be passed on.
The intermarriage is inevitable as far as I'm concerned, because we are a drop in the ocean, especially the exile community. We are just 130,000 in total. So we can't expect our children to be stuck by themselves all the time and not meet other friends and not associate with other non-Tibetans. And so this is inevitable. But does the culture remain? That's the question. The culture is what you feel inside and not what you are outside. So if you have a stronger grip on your culture inwardly, you can survive even with a non-Tibetan spouse.
Maintaining a sense of being Tibetan for the present generation is not easy. It will be increasingly difficult for the children of mixed marriages, and it seems very likely that future generations will find it almost impossible. Over the years, the Dalai Lama has been essential in keeping the Tibetan struggle alive. By 1985, no progress had been made on negotiating a return to Tibet. In the Strasbourg statement, the Dalai Lama proposed a non-violent solution where Tibet would have autonomy within China and abandon demands for independence. This policy is known as the Middle Way.
So many of our people are suffering in Tibet. Our culture is being diluted, and our nation is suffering as a nation, not having the right to be a nation. So I don't see any point in wasting time like this. So why not come in the middle way? And therefore he proposed the middle way.
The Tibetan Youth Congress, numbering 15,000, is the only organisation that opposes the Middle Way and actively campaigns for a totally free Tibet.
We have Tibetan Youth Congress and other people who want full freedom. I think that's wonderful. The middle policy is His Holiness's policy and the policy of the Tibetan government. And His Holiness has not shutting up people who have different views.
The single biggest damage that has done to the Tibetan struggle, in my view, has been the announcement of this middle way policy by His Holiness and its active adoption by the exiled Tibetan government, as also all the other organizations. I am on record for having said that this current policy, which surrenders independence and seeks association and autonomy within China, is first of all undemocratic, on the grounds that the few of us in exile do not have the mandate to change the goal. And I've also gone so far as to say this is un-Buddhist. If the basic tenet of and teaching of Buddhism is that everything is impermanent and changing, why must we accept that only the occupation of Tibet by China will be permanent, everything else will change? Where is it written? So to that extent, I tried very hard, because it's not enough just to say His Holiness should change. There must also be a public movement and momentum to persuade him to change. This, sadly, has not happened. Never before, until His Holiness announced the Strasbourg statement, were we divided on the question of independence. Today, it's not just that the community is divided. I think every single thinking Tibetan is divided into, between our reverence for His Holiness. You must understand, Tibetans just don't respect the Dalai Lama. We revere and we worship him. And on the other hand, it's not just our desire, our need for independence.
These differing opinions about the Middle Way policy pose a serious threat to Tibetan unity. China continues to reject all attempts to find a solution, and there is serious doubt whether it will ever relinquish control over Tibet. The Dalai Lama, whose name in Tibetan means ocean of wisdom, is the spiritual guide as well as the political leader of all Tibetans. The vital role he plays in all aspects of Tibetan life cannot be overestimated. World awareness of Tibetan Buddhism has increased in the last few years. The Dalai Lama has travelled extensively to teach Buddhism and talk about the situation in Tibet.
I think spontaneous, first feeling is I.
Because we lost the country, because His Holiness was able to come out, and because people were able to hear him and find sense in it, and I think it spread all over, him and many other teachers, wonderful teachers that have spread it. And I think it's wonderful because it gave chance to many others who want to hear it. Not necessarily become Buddhists, but as long as they find some sense in it and happiness in hearing it and implementing it in their lives. I think that's wonderful. And I'm not saying that it's good that they all become Buddhist or not. That is not the point. But I think it's wonderful that the word of Buddha or Tibetan Buddhism spread all over the world.
Those who've had personal contact with the Dalai Lama find his attitude to life inspiring in its simplicity.
You know, His Holiness is my brother, okay? Just taken as a person. You know, he works so much, he has gained so much friendship for Tibet. You know, he's the guiding light. You look at his own life, the way he talks to people, the way he gets things done, and he does inspire people. He taught me how to think on my own. And he encourages people to be creative. See, he's a wonderful teacher. Through his example, through the things he tells you in conversation, even through jokes. See? And what really affected me is, you know, his personal lifestyle. Even though he's the Dalai Lama, he's not spoiled. And the way he thinks, it's so simple and pure.
One of the Dalai Lama's intentions is to reform Tibetan society and create a democratic system so that all Tibetans can eventually govern themselves. The government in exile, which has limited power, is the first step in this process.
In other parts of the world, you know, leaders want power, you know, but in this special Dalai Lama leader, he's saying, no, I don't want power. And people are always saying, no, please, you are the one who's going to lead us to the right destination. And he said, look, I mean, you have to decide your future, you know, and he's giving all the power down, you know. And this is incredible. We are trying to do our best to be more democratic. The idea is to bring this to Tibet.
I can't imagine any community doing what we are doing without His Holiness's leadership. And this, the more I age, the more I realize, is because of his kindness, care, and genuine concern for the benefit of his people. And because of that, he's been able to hold the people together, love the people, and have been loved by the people.
As the Dalai Lama is now in his 70s, there is growing concern about the fate of the Tibetans after his death. There is a real possibility the culture will be unable to survive without his guiding and stabilizing influence.
I can't see any other leadership like his coming up immediately anyway. So we will definitely have a period of time where people will miss his leadership, where people will feel the gap, and because we are so used to such a wonderful leader. But eventually, I also hope and pray that the nation survives.
I personally feel there are difficult days ahead. And I think it's good to expect, you know, the future as difficult, then we are prepared for it. If it's not difficult, wow, let's have a party. And then if it's difficult, okay, we anticipate it, fine, let's take it into our stride.
The future for our culture's survival outside Tibet is getting difficult, and it can be more difficult if we remain too long outside Tibet. And I think this is what the Chinese government is hoping. They just ignore us, they don't give us a solution, they don't listen to what we appeal, and so they must be also calculating that, you know, the longer they're outside, they'll die a natural death.
These remarkable people passionately hold on to the belief that someday they will return to their homeland. Many individuals and groups throughout the world support the Tibetan cause, But the lack of political will in most countries and the fear of alienating China have produced no significant changes. There is now a real possibility that this culture may soon be consigned to history.
In Tibet at the moment, in towns like Lhasa and Shigetse, we are already outnumbered by conservative estimates 1 to 3. Yet at the moment all is not yet lost, and that is why it hurts so much. In the countryside we are still in the majority. But the future is, as I keep saying, very bleak. Time is running out. And to that extent, that affects any prospect for a personal future and the future of my children. I continue to encourage my daughter and my son to dedicate themselves to the cause of a free Tibet, and that they will learn to not only study the language but to think as Tibetans, because in the end our thoughts determine what we are and what we do, and that they will continue to believe in the idea of a free Tibet. So that, I hope, will give some sense of meaning to their lives. But then for their children, I'm not hopeful. And for the future of the Tibetan nation itself, I'm not hopeful. For my own personal future, I've promised myself one last thing. I will die in Tibet.